Hello ladies and gentlemen, my name is Phil and welcome to Grounded, the series which looks at airlines of yesteryear. This episode will take a look at Palmair, the near legendary little airline that could from Bournemouth. Due to the company structure, we'll have to look at the parent company Bath Travel as well as Palmair. Palmair itself was a tour operator and in a way could have been considered a paper airline, so let's take a look at their story. The origins of Palmair go right back to 1924, when Reginald Ernest Bath started his travel business from a shop in Albert Road, Bournemouth. RE Bath Travel Services plodded on and wouldn't begin expansion until Reginald's son, Peter, returned from his service in the Royal Navy in 1953. Peter began expanding the business, opening travel agency offices across Dorset, and business really took off once the company became a significant agent for P&O and Cunard. 1958 would see the creation of the tour operator Palmair, with its first flight being to Mallorca from Herne Airport in 1958. It happened almost by accident. Ray Barker, who was the managing director of Lond's King's Flights, was on the point of cancelling a 2-week holiday from Gatwick to San Agustin through lack of support. Peter Bath, who was a good friend, persuaded him to operate the flight from Bournemouth instead and pledged that his company, Bath Travel, will be able to fill the 36-seat Viking aircraft. The following Tuesday, the holidays were advertised in the Bournemouth Echo, and by Saturday all the seats had been sold, thus Palmair tour operations had begun. The first flights were made using a Vickers Viking aircraft operated by British European Airways. The following year, a larger Vickers Viscount was used. Every flight was personally seen off by Peter Bath, and passengers boarded via a red carpet, making sure they departed in style. Palmair would continue to grow over the next 30 years, with an ever-increasing list of destinations, from Mallorca and Ibiza to Corfu and the French Riviera. In the 1980s they operated behind the Iron Curtain, with flights to Dubrovnik and the Slovenian resorts of Lake Bled and Portoroz. While those flights were axed due to the Balkans conflict, it did show that Bath Travel and Palmair were not afraid to offer something that the regular travel companies balked at. Over the years, Palmair chartered in a variety of aircraft from carriers such as Dan Air London, British Caledonian, British European, Air Cymru, Inter-European and Princess Air. None of these airlines were based in Bournemouth, and with ever-increasing costs, especially during the early 90s recession, it was becoming harder to persuade these airlines to position empty aircraft to and from Bournemouth. Bath Travel decided to form an airline of its own, Palmair. It was officially named RE Bath Travel Services Palmair Limited, commonly known as Palmair, but referred to as Palmair Flightline for the first few years. Beginning in 1993 with a dedicated BAE 146 Whisperjet operated by Southend-based Flightline, Palmair's destiny was in their own hands. By having the aircraft based at Bournemouth, it reduced the charter fees and also gave greater flexibility as the aircraft was dedicated to Palmair and wasn't required anywhere else, giving Bath Travel complete control of the scheduling. It wasn't just the scheduling that Bath Travel had control over. While the pilots were hired by Flightline, the cabin crew were hand-picked by Peter Bath and his cabin service manager. Palmair technically wasn't an airline, however. Flightline operated the aircraft on their own certificate and provided the pilots and maintenance. Palmair chartered the aircraft from Flightline, scheduling the flights to suit their needs, with Bath Travel selling the Palmair package holidays and seat-only flights. It's effectively made Palmair a paper airline, but one with a strong local identity. The Palmair experience was unlike any other airline. Following check-in, you'd be allocated your seat. These were worked out the night before by the cabin service manager at her dining room table. Peter Bath himself would be at the gate to welcome you to the flight, and then begin boarding the aircraft from the centre outward 2 rows at a time to prevent all the argy-bargy that normally ensues. There were no departures before 9 AM, and certainly no night flights, as Peter Bath believed that they were antisocial, though I'm not sure if he meant for the passengers or for the airport neighbours. The in-flight magazine was named Whispers, after the BAE 146 Whisperjet, and rather uniquely, it would feature a small profile on each of the cabin crew, and come the dawn of the internet age, the Palmair website would also do this, which just made the airline feel even more friendly. The aircraft themselves were immaculate inside. There was even fresh flowers in the loo. Palmair had also removed a row or two of seats, allowing improved legroom throughout. Their sole aircraft, the BAE 146-300, were a very basic livery, just white with Palmair and Flightline titles. To be fair, it matched the Bath Travel storefronts of red letters on a white background, so you could say it was more brand identity rather than being cheap. Palmair offered day trips with flights departing Bournemouth in the morning and returning that evening. These were very reasonably priced considering what was on offer. Destinations included Jersey, the Isle of Man, Venice, Krakow, Iceland, Rome, Copenhagen, Prague, and interestingly, the Normandy beaches. 1996 would also see the introduction of long-haul flying. Bath Travel arranged for Leisure International to operate a Boeing 767 to Orlando, Florida, bringing transatlantic flying back to Bournemouth after 50 years. Leisure International would operate a Boeing 767 on more transatlantic flights for Bath Travel and Palmair, with flights to the Dominican Republic and Barbados, both in connection with cruise packages. There was also Concorde. In 1996, the runway at Bournemouth Airport had been extended and was now able to handle the supersonic jet. Palmair decided to charter Concorde for a special celebration at the airport. On the 21st of April, 100 people were taken to London Heathrow by coach, where they would then experience a 20-minute subsonic flight to the south coast. Back at Bournemouth, there was one heck of a crowd. According to reports, there was over 25,000 people who came to the area to see Concorde arrive, with a further 5,000 at the airport itself. A further 100 passengers paid £600 for a flight out of Bournemouth and a supersonic champagne lunch over the Atlantic before landing at Heathrow and being coached back. Further Concorde trips followed to Paris, Nice, Monte Carlo, Venice, and even Tenerife and Lanzarote in the Canary Islands. These short package holidays involved flying out on the regular Palmair aircraft and returning to the UK on the Supersonic Beauty. In total, 4,400 passengers travelled on 44 such Concorde trips organised by Bath Travel and Palmair. On the 7th of August 1997, 100 Bath Travel passengers left Southampton aboard the QE2 ocean liner for a 6-night cruise to New York, where after several nights in the Big Apple they would return directly to Bournemouth on board Concorde. Saturday the 16th of August marked the first ever transatlantic supersonic flight into Bournemouth. An outbound flight to New York was on the cards too. However, as the runway at Bournemouth couldn't handle a fully fueled Concorde, the flights would instead have to leave from Boscombe Down. The former airbase was located around 31 miles away from Bournemouth Airport, and it was still in use by the Ministry of Defence. Negotiations were successful, and in 1998 Concorde would take 100 passengers on a supersonic flight to New York, where they would then board the QE2 for a cruise back to the UK. 1997 would see Palmair win the first of many accolades, when the consumer association magazine Which conducted a survey of 20,000 readers, of which Palmair came out as the 5th best airline in the world and number 1 British airline. Not bad for an airline with just one aircraft. The Palmair flight line BAE 146 would serve 70 destinations across Europe and North Africa during the 1990s. However, as the new millennium approached, changes were happening behind the scenes. David Skilcorn, the managing director of Palmair, said in an interview that the UK Civil Aviation Authority had conducted a major re-weighting exercise, which concluded that the passengers and their baggage were heavier. This was very important, as the CAA used this conclusion to revise the weights used when calculating flight plans, and this had a detrimental effect on the Whisperjet. The increase in calculated weights meant that the Whisperjet would now struggle to operate fully loaded flights to Faro and Malaga, 2 relatively short flights. Stopping for fuel en route was not really an option either, as the Whisperjet already stopped in Jersey on both routes in order to pick up and drop off passengers. Adding a second stop would seriously increase costs, as well as run into crew flight time duty limitations. Flightline was unable to offer a more suitable aircraft to Palmair, and so the Palmair Flightline partnership ended, with Palmair opting for European Aviation Air Charter as their aircraft provider. European would operate a Boeing 737-200 for Palmair from January 2000. The old 737 was certainly a noisier option compared to the Whisperjet than it previously used. However, it did have several benefits. It had a greater capacity of 124 seats compared to the 110 in the BAE 146. Crucially, it didn't have performance restrictions which had hindered the 146's ability to operate certain routes without fuel stops. Prior to the introduction of the European 737, Palmair had chartered in other carriers to operate certain longer distance routes such as Tenerife and Madeira when that was added in the winter of 1998. With the arrival of their own 737, they would no longer need to do this and thus keep their costs down. The summer of 2000 would see Lanzarote added to the list of destinations served by Palmair European. Their 737 would see a lot of use, as it would operate regular flights to Alicante, Faro, Malaga, Mahon, Madeira, Croatia, Corfu, Palma and Lanzarote. The number of day trips skyrocketed too. Over 50 day trips took place with Copenhagen, Krakow, Stockholm, Monte Carlo, Salzburg, Keflavik, Berlin, Latvia, Rome, Seville, Marrakesh and Munich, all visited during the year. Cairo was also offered as a day trip. However, this would be operated by a Monarch Airlines 757 on behalf of Palmair. Palmair established a good relationship with Monarch, who would also operate a New York City Christmas shopping city break that November. The trip actually involved 2 aircraft, one departing Bournemouth with the other from Exeter. Monarch would continue to operate the Egyptian day trips throughout 2001, as well as the New York Christmas shopping trip which went ahead in November despite the atrocities which had taken place just 2 months prior. On these transatlantic flights, the 757s would head for Gander, where they would refuel before continuing on to the Big Apple. Return flights to the UK were non-stop. 2002 saw the biggest flying programme yet for the Palmair 737. Tenerife would now be served with their own equipment rather than a third-party airline. On the day trip front, Helsinki, Bordeaux and Northern Iceland were added during the year. In fact, the flying programme got quite intense, so on some occasions, European would draft in one of their other Boeing 737-200s to help out. Monarch would once again be on hand to operate that year's New York City Christmas shopping trip, however, only from Exeter, as Bournemouth had something bigger. European had been on a bit of an expansion drive and had found itself the proud owner of several Boeing 747s, quite a step up from their fleet of BAC 111s and 737s, but that's a story for another day. One of these 747-200s was used to operate the November 2002 New York City trip from Bournemouth, quite a step up in capacity from the Monarch 757. 2003 would be a tough year for the UK travel industry in general. There was lots of uncertainty caused by the Iraq War, the SARS outbreak, giving generally less favourable conditions. Both Palmair and Bath Travel survived with little disruption, with the group making an operating profit of £1.18 million, down slightly from £1.99 million the year before, and £1.35 million in 2001. European Air Charter had started to show signs of trouble, however. Palmair would support the company by making additional advance payments for their flying programme. A second Boeing 737-200 joined the Palmair fleet in April 2003, giving the company more flexibility in its scheduling and allowed for an increase in destinations, both day trip and long stay. New day trip destinations included Tallinn in Estonia, Luxembourg, Cork, Sardinia, Gibraltar and Bratislava among others. In total, there were over 40 international day trips and 30 day trips to Jersey through the year. The 2002 New York Christmas shopping trip from Bournemouth had sold out so quickly that for 2003 Palmair organised 2 trips from Bournemouth, both using an EAC 747. One trip took place in November, with the second in December. The 747 had both an economy and business class cabin, so upgrades were offered for £499. There would be no flight from Exeter, however. 2003 hadn't been all doom and gloom though, as Palmair was voted the best airline in the world by Which magazine, having moved up 3 places from their 1997 and 1998 accolades, and 2 more places from 2002. 2004 would see both 737s in action on the regular charter routes, with Dubrovnik and Split being new destinations. New day trip destinations included Milan and Brescia for Lake Garda, both with Cologne and Vienna being served for the Christmas markets. There would again be 2 flights to New York, one in late November, with the second being a 5-night trip over Christmas itself, with the flight out on December 23rd. Both Bath Travel and Palmair had recorded a profit for 2004. However, for the second year running, Palmair would find itself paying out advance cash payments to European Aviation to help their cash flow. This actually caused the group to make a loss of £1.52 million, and the situation at European was going to get worse. Palmair's aircraft provider was still struggling financially. Having taken nearly £4 million in advance payments from Palmair, it was still struggling to make ends meet. European Air Charter had been in a period of change ahead of a potential sale. When that sale fell through, the company was forced to enter into a company voluntary arrangement, or CVA, in April 2004, sort of a Chapter 11 equivalent, and a special case in the British aviation industry. In a CVA, a business proposes an agreement to repay part or all of the money it owes to its creditors over a fixed period of time. It is a better alternative to entering administration, where in the aviation industry it almost always ends up with an immediate grounding. In fact, I can only think of one airline, Gill Airways, which had entered administration and managed to work its way back out of it. Of course, a crucial component to EAC was that they owned their aircraft, and with Palmair paying in advance, they could at least pay the bills and prevent their aircraft being impounded. One big change at European was the withdrawal of the 747 fleet. This in itself only affected the Christmas flights to New York. However, 2005 would see jet fuel costs rise quite sharply, which was bad news for an airline with a fleet of gas-guzzling old Boeings. Palmair added both Paphos, Cyprus and Luxor, Egypt to their destination list for 2005. However, these flights would be operated by Astraeus, as both were beyond the capabilities of their EAC 737-200. Bath Travel started to offer city breaks as well as their regular day trip offerings. The first of these were in the new destinations of Rome, St. Petersburg and Marrakesh, bringing Palmair to Russia and Morocco for the first time. In 2005, Bath Travel and Palmair made a small post-tax profit of close to £250,000. However, this was better than the loss from the year before. Once again, Palmair would receive several accolades, voted the second best airline in the world, having been usurped by the much larger Singapore Airlines. 2006 was a tougher year for Palmair. Competition had moved into Bournemouth, with Thomson Airways, later TUI Airlines UK, basing 2 aircraft there, though Bath Travel would actually take some seats on the competing carriers' flights. Palmair also reduced its own capacity and axed both the Cyprus and Egypt flights which had been operated on their behalf by Astraeus. Despite cutting capacity, their average load factor dropped from 91.4% to 87.8%. Their direct operating costs had increased too, up 3.5%. The group still made a small profit, however, at just under £88,000. Sadly, on December 22, 2006, the company chairman, Peter Bath, died at the age of 79. 2007 would see a further reduction in capacity, with Palmair European operating just one Boeing 737-200. They would transport 40,000 passengers, which was a reduction of 7,000 from the year before. However, their average load factor increased to 91.5%, and their direct operating costs dropped 2.1%. 2008 was a tough year for everyone, and saw a number of high-profile failures. American Transair, EOS, Silverjet, Zoom, and of course XL Airways. However, Palmair weathered the storm. In fact, Palmair had increased their programme capacity, carrying 44,800 passengers with a load factor of 90%. This was very important too, as the price of jet fuel had skyrocketed, leading to an increase in their contracted flying costs. The economy had also taken a hit, with sterling weakening against the euro and, crucially, the US dollar. While Palmair didn't have to pay costs in dollars like most other airlines, European Air Charter did, and were badly affected by this. At the end of November, European Aviation Air Charter Limited ceased trading, with them entering liquidation proceedings shortly after. Palmair were very quick to respond, hiring in the services of Jet2, who would use one of their 737-300s to cover the Palmair winter programme. Jet2, formerly known as Channel Express, would operate the aircraft over the winter period, whilst Palmair tried to source a new aircraft provider for the long run. The fact that Palmair reacted so quickly certainly saved the company and prevented it too from joining that year's list of failed airlines. Jet2 would only be able to operate the Palmair programme until April 2009, as they would need the aircraft themselves for their own busy summer programme. There was much speculation over who would operate on behalf of Palmair, with notable suggestions including Fly Globespan, who themselves were experiencing financial difficulties, Viking, and the less said about them the better, and even Flybe possibly operating 2 Embraer jets for them. Viking and its Swedish partner Torair would indeed operate flights for Palmair using a mix of Boeing 737s and MD-83s from April until May, when Astraeus took over with much fanfare. Astraeus had previously operated a handful of flights for Palmair, and while it had previously been a charter airline itself, it had moved into the ACMI market. Acting fast, Astraeus was able to acquire a 737-500 which had been released from British Airways in April and get it ready in time for service by Palmair. On the 12th of May, there was a big ceremony inside the hangar at Bournemouth Airport for the grand unveiling of PJPJ, their new aircraft. The registration was chosen in honour of the late Peter Bath's nickname, PJ. The aircraft itself would also be named the Spirit of Peter Bath. As before, the aircraft would have a white fuselage and red Palmair titles, the exception being that this time there were full-size billboard titles, making it hard to miss. The 737-500 would have 123 seats and longer legs than its predecessor. It was also far more fuel efficient, which would help keep the operating costs down. The greater range would allow Palmair to serve new, more distant destinations. 2 new winter destinations were announced, Fuerteventura in the Canary Islands and Monastir, Tunisia. Fuerteventura would be served from both Bournemouth and Exeter using what is known as a W pattern, where a single aircraft operates the flights, allowing 2 airports to be served and increases aircraft utilisation. To complement the new aircraft, the Palmair website received a revamp, complete with an online booking system and staff and crew profiles. There would be no day trips during 2009 as the company had been focused on resuming a steady long-term air service. Despite the positive steps, however, it was another difficult year for the company. The huge recession combined with an increase in competition had hit Palmair, lowering their average load factor to 84.2% from 90% the year before. Financially, the group made a post-tax loss of just over $2.02 million, nearly triple the figure from 2008. This was very understandable, however, and soon Palmair announced plans for summer 2010. Day trips would resume from April, with Jersey, Venice, Krakow, Rome, Prague and Zurich among others on offer. 2010 would see Palmair serve Faro, Corfu, Dubrovnik, Dublin, Fuerteventura, Brescia, Lanzarote, Madeira, Palma, Mahon and Tenerife with regular holiday flights. The day trips would take place on a Tuesday, as this was the one clear day where the aircraft didn't have any other flights planned. The 2010 flying programme was disrupted by the Icelandic volcanic ash cloud, but otherwise went ahead without any major problems. In August, it was revealed that Palmair was considering suspending flight operations over the quiet winter months, particularly November, December and January, as the expected passenger numbers was considerably lower than the year before, mainly due to the ongoing economic situation and poor exchange rate against the euro keeping potential travellers away. While nothing firm had been announced, Palmair had not yet published its winter holiday brochure, and more worryingly, prospective customers phoning the company were advised to book the winter holidays with other tour operators. It wasn't until October 28th that Palmair officially announced that they would be suspending their flying activities. This decision had been made in order to secure the company's long-term future. Palmair had been making increasing losses for several years, and this was no longer considered sustainable, especially as the ongoing economic situation, high fuel costs and greatly increased competition all made a quick return to profitability look very unlikely. The Boeing 737 had been on a 3-year lease from Astraeus, but would be returned early, with Palmair, the tour operator, chartering seats on other carriers as it had done up until 1993 in the formation of Palmair Flightline. The tour operator would have a small programme from February through to April, with just 2 destinations, Lanzarote and Tenerife, with both being operated by Thomson Airways. Palmair was winding down in an orderly manner, no sudden midnight groundings which was the norm. Palmair Managing Director David Skilcorn said, "Our industry is littered with the corpses of firms which have collapsed, with people being let down, left stranded and sometimes out of pocket. I am very proud of the fact that we have decided to slow down and eventually stop in a very ordered way." He also said that Palmair was going into a deep freeze until market conditions could make it a viable business again. Unfortunately, however, Palmair would never be revived. The Palmair 737 operated the final few days of the summer season before being returned to Astraeus on October 31st, bringing an end to this story. So, what went wrong? There are several reasons why Palmair ultimately called it a day. The company had been making heavy losses for several years, compounded by losing a lot of money following the collapse of European aviation air charter. The huge increase in costs was also a major factor. The price of jet fuel had more than quadrupled since it began flying operations in 1993. Only so much of this could be absorbed by increased ticket prices, as competition was a big threat. It was arguably the competition which was the final nail in the Palmair coffin. In the early years, Palmair pretty much had Bournemouth Airport to itself. 2005 would see charter competition when Thomson Fly based 2 aircraft there, though Palmair had managed to fight them off on 1 or 2 routes, but otherwise coexisted peacefully enough. It was Ryanair that did it. Well, sort of. Bournemouth Airport had been acquired by the Manchester Airports Group in 2001, and in 2008 it had set about expanding the airport's terminal and facilities. It cost them nearly £50 million to do, just when the recession hit and the airline industry was on its knees. Talk about bad timing. In a move that doesn't surprise this cynical Mancunian, MAG started charging fees to pick up and drop off passengers in an effort to recoup some of the money spent on this expensive work. That wasn't what did it, though. It was the fact that the airport authorities, in an effort to entice Ryanair to open a base there, went and handed Ryanair commercially sensitive information regarding Palmair to try and prove the airport's viability. Allegedly, the airport authorities also offered Ryanair concessions and financial incentives in a further effort to bring in the Irish giant. Ryanair would go on to base 2 aircraft at the airport and operate numerous routes in competition with its far more charming rival. Ultimately, Palmair had been losing money for years. The parent company decided it was necessary to shut the operation down in order to save the whole group, and thus they did so. It was such prudence that had allowed BAF Travel to last over 50 years in the travel industry after all. This is all too depressing, so let's have a quick look at what happened next. Well, BAF Travel were making a great success in the cruise industry, having been National Cruise Retailer of the Year in both 2010 and 2011. They had also formed Cruise Saver Travel and then set about running the Cruise Saver Express. This was a nifty idea for shuttling cruise passengers from various points across the country to cruise ships docked in Southampton. Operated by Direct Rail Services, or DRS, the boat train consisted of a number of Mark II air-conditioned carriages and 2 Class 47 diesel locomotives. The train would only carry passengers who were connecting to or from a cruise organised by BAF Travel. On the 19th of April 2011, a ceremony was held at Southampton where locomotive number 47810 was named Peter Bath MBE. This locomotive would carry the name until it was withdrawn by DRS in 2018. The loco was sold on and continues to run on the main line, but the Cruise Saver Express had long finished by then. Without Palmair, BAF Travel returned to profitability. However, in 2013, Hayes Travel would acquire the company for £7.6 million. Hayes Travel were, and still are, the largest independent travel agency in the UK. They would later gain national prominence following their acquisition of the former Thomas Cook travel agencies after their 2019 implosion. Initially, BAF Travel would continue on as a brand. However, by the end of 2015, the brand was replaced by that of Hayes. Remarkably, in 2020, RE BAF Travel Service Limited is still in business. It has been renamed as Hayes Property Services and is solely an investment property business. Its income is derived from rental income from group companies or third parties, basically a landlord to the former BAF Travel agencies. The former PJPJ, which had been returned to Astraeus, would be leased to its sister airline, Iceland Express, until Astraeus themselves collapsed in November 2011. The aircraft was stored at Lasham, one of the UK's boneyards. However, there was one last hurrah for this aircraft. In 2013, the aircraft was used to film scenes for the 2014 movie Miracle Landing on the Hudson, not starring Tom Hanks as Sully, but John O'Mahony, not to be confused with John, Fraser's dad, Mahoney. For this, the left-hand side of the aircraft was painted up in US Airways livery for the post-ditching scenes. The aircraft would eventually be broken up in 2018. So, that's the Palmair story. Until next time, thanks for watching.